The day began like any other Manhattan General Hospital, with the familiar buzz of medical equipment and the hurried footsteps of hospital staff echoing through the pristine corridors. Michelle Anderson had just finished her morning rounds, her comfortable nursing shoes squeaking against the polished floor as she made her way to the staff room for what she hoped would be a quick cup of coffee. "Michelle, can you step into my office for a moment?" called out Dr. Richardson, the head of the ICU department. There was something different in his voice, a mix of hesitation and urgency that made Michelle's heart skip a beat. Inside the office, she found not only Dr. Richardson but also two men in expensive suits who looked like they'd stepped out of a Wall Street boardroom. The atmosphere was tense, and Michelle could feel that something big was about to happen. "We have a special assignment for you," Dr. Richardson began, his fingers drumming nervously on his desk. "Robert Maxwell was brought in last night." "Yes. Robert Maxwell, the billionaire." Michelle's eyes widened. Everyone knew about Robert Maxwell, the self-made businessman whose name graced half the buildings in the financial district. His face was constantly in the business section of every newspaper, though lately he'd become somewhat of a recluse. "He suffered a severe stroke," one of the suited men explained, introducing himself as Maxwell's personal attorney. "We need the best care possible, and your record speaks for itself. 10 years of experience, specialized training in stroke recovery, and most importantly, a perfect track record with long-term care patients." Michelle noticed how they exchanged glances when mentioning her qualifications, almost as if they were trying to convince themselves. She'd seen that look before, the stubborn surprise when people realized a black woman could be at the top of her field. But she'd learned long ago to let her work speak for itself. "The position comes with some unique requirements," the attorney continued. "You'll need to sign extensive non-disclosure agreements. Mr. Maxwell's condition must remain absolutely confidential. The compensation will be substantial, of course." As they discussed the details, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this assignment than they were telling her. The way the second suit kept checking his phone, the nervous energy in the room, something wasn't adding up. When she finally entered Maxwell's private suite on the top floor of the hospital, Michelle was struck by how ordinary he looked. The man whose net worth could probably buy the entire hospital lay still, his chest rising and falling steadily with the help of machines. Gone was the commanding presence from magazine covers, replaced by an elderly man who seemed smaller and more vulnerable than she'd imagined. The room itself was larger than most hospital rooms, with a view overlooking the city he'd helped build. Yet despite his wealth, she noticed there were no flowers, no get-well cards, no personal touches that usually filled a patient's room. Just expensive medical equipment and an unsettling silence. As Michelle began her initial assessment, checking his vitals and reviewing his charts, she spoke to him softly, the way she did with all her comatose patients. "Well, Mr. Maxwell, looks like it's going to be you and me for a while. Don't worry, you're in good hands." She couldn't have known then how those words would prove to be more significant than she ever imagined. As she settled into her new routine, Michelle was completely unaware that this assignment would uncover secrets that would change not only her life, but the lives of countless others. Just before ending her first shift, while organizing his personal belongings, something caught her eye. A small, worn photograph peeking out from beneath his medical charts. She hesitated for a moment, knowing she shouldn't pry, but something about it called to her. As she glanced at it, her heart nearly stopped. The face in the old photograph was startlingly familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a story that had been decades in the making. Over the next few weeks, Michelle fell into a steady rhythm caring for Mr. Maxwell. The private suite on the top floor became like a second home, with the gentle hum of medical equipment providing a constant backdrop to her days. She'd arrive early each morning, drawing back the curtains to let the sunrise flood the room, believing that natural light was good for patients even in a coma. "Good morning, Mr. Maxwell," she'd say cheerfully, checking his vitals while updating him about the weather or interesting hospital gossip. "It's going to be a beautiful day today. The cherry blossoms in the park across the street are finally blooming." She noticed how the expensive monitors beeped slightly differently when she talked to him, suggesting that somewhere in his unconscious state he might be listening. This encouraged her to share more, filling the quiet hours with stories about her life. "You know, I grew up in a small town in Georgia," she told him one afternoon while adjusting his pillows. "My mama worked 3 jobs to put me through nursing school. She always said education was the key to changing our stars." Michelle smiled at the memory. Guess she was right. Here I am, taking care of one of the most powerful men in New York. The lonely nature of her assignment became more apparent as days passed. Despite Mr. Maxwell's immense wealth and influence, visitors were surprisingly rare. His nephew Thomas would stop by occasionally, always dressed in designer suits that seemed too flashy for a hospital visit. He'd barely acknowledge Michelle's presence, spending his brief visits speaking in hushed tones on his phone or rifling through papers he'd bring in a leather briefcase. "Something about that man doesn't sit right with me," Michelle whispered to Mr. Maxwell after one such visit. "He seems more interested in your paperwork than your recovery." She noticed how the heart monitor would show slightly elevated readings whenever Thomas was in the room, making her wonder if even in his comatose state, Mr. Maxwell shared her unease. The only other regular visitor was Mr. Parker, Maxwell's attorney, who would come by weekly with documents and updates about the business empire that continued running even with its leader unconscious. Unlike Thomas, Mr. Parker always treated Michelle with respect, asking about Maxwell's condition and thanking her for her dedicated care. During the quiet night shifts, Michelle would sometimes read to Mr. Maxwell from the day's newspaper, focusing on the business section. "Your company's stock is up again," she'd tell him. "Whatever systems you put in place, they're working like clockwork." She developed a habit of bringing him up to speed on world events, somehow feeling that a man like him would want to stay informed, even in his current state. One night, while organizing the growing collection of medical charts and personal items, Michelle came across an old leather-bound book. It looked like a journal, its pages yellow with age. She knew she shouldn't open it, but as she moved to put it away, a black and white photograph slipped out onto the floor. When she picked it up, her hands began to tremble. The photograph showed a group of people at what appeared to be a civil rights demonstration in the 1960s. But what made her heart race was a face she recognized immediately, her grandmother standing proudly next to a young man who could only be Mr. Maxwell. "What in the world?" she whispered, studying the image closer. Her grandmother had never mentioned knowing Robert Maxwell, yet here they were, standing side by side, both looking determined and purposeful. The photo showed them in front of what appeared to be a newly opened business, with her grandmother holding a set of keys. Just then, the monitors started beeping at a slightly different rhythm. Michelle quickly tucked the photo away, but her mind was racing with questions. What was her grandmother's connection to Robert Maxwell? Why had this never been mentioned in family stories? And most intriguingly, was it pure coincidence that she, of all nurses, had been chosen for this assignment? As she finished her shift that morning, Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple old photograph. What she didn't know was that this discovery was just the beginning of a story that would unravel decades of secrets and change her life forever. The discovery of the photograph kept Michelle awake for days. Every time she looked at Mr. Maxwell's peaceful face, she wondered about his connection to her grandmother. Finally, during her next day off, she drove to her mother's house, the old photograph carefully tucked in her purse. Her mother, Patricia, was in the kitchen baking cookies when Michelle arrived. The familiar smell of chocolate chip and vanilla filled the air, reminding Michelle of countless childhood afternoons spent at this very kitchen table. "Mama, I need to ask you something," Michelle said, pulling out the photograph. "I found this while taking care of my patient." She watched her mother's face carefully as she slid the photo across the table. Patricia's hands froze mid-motion, cookie dough still clinging to her fingers. Her eyes widened as she stared at the image. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, sinking slowly into a kitchen chair. "You know about this?" Michelle leaned forward eagerly. "Mama, why didn't anyone ever tell me Grandma knew Robert Maxwell?" Patricia wiped her hands on her apron, taking a deep breath. "Baby, there's so much about your grandmother you don't know. Those were complicated times." She touched the photograph gently, as if it might crumble under her fingers. "Your grandmother Martha wasn't just Maxwell's housekeeper, she was his guardian angel." Over the next hour, Patricia shared a story that seemed almost impossible to believe. In the 1960s, when racial tensions were at their peak, Robert Maxwell had been different from other wealthy white businessmen. He'd secretly worked with Michelle's grandmother to help establish black-owned businesses in their community. That building in the photo? Patricia pointed to the background. That was the first black-owned bank in our county. Your grandmother helped Maxwell understand what our community needed, and he provided the funding, all under the table, of course. Back then, it would have ruined him if people knew. Michelle sat back, stunned. But why keep it secret all these years? Mr. Maxwell is famous for his philanthropy now. Protection, Patricia said simply. Both ways. Some people didn't want to see our community succeed, and others wouldn't have trusted your grandmother if they knew she was working with a white businessman. They kept their partnership quiet to make sure the work could continue. As Michelle drove back to the hospital for her night shift, her mind was spinning with this new information. The quiet ICU room felt different now, charged with the weight of history. She looked at Mr. Maxwell's face, trying to see the young man from the photograph who had secretly fought for change. While checking his vitals that night, she noticed something unusual. The folder containing his recent medical records had been moved, and some papers seemed out of order. Michelle knew she hadn't misplaced anything. Her organizational skills were one reason she'd been chosen for this assignment. Going through the records to reorganize them, she found a new document slipped between the pages. It was a power of attorney form, dated just before Mr. Maxwell's stroke, with Thomas's signature at the bottom. Something about the signature looked off. It was shaky, unlike Thomas's usual confident scrawl she'd seen on other documents. The monitors suddenly showed a spike in Mr. Maxwell's heart rate. Michelle looked up sharply and saw his fingers twitching, the first voluntary movement she'd seen in weeks. Moving closer, she watched in amazement as his eyelids fluttered. "Mr. Maxwell?" she called softly, pressing the call button for the doctor. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first. When they'd finally settled on her face, she saw something that made her heart skip. Recognition. Not of her, but of someone else. His lips moved, trying to form words. "Martha," he whispered hoarsely, using her grandmother's name. Tears formed in his eyes as he struggled to speak again. "Martha, you came back. You have to. Stop him." Before Michelle could respond, the room filled with medical staff responding to her call. As they swarmed around Mr. Maxwell, checking his vitals and responding to his unexpected awakening, Michelle stood back, her mind racing. Whatever connection her grandmother had with Robert Maxwell, it was clearly more significant than just business. And something told her that his fear of Thomas wasn't just a confused patient's paranoia. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Mr. Maxwell steadily regained consciousness. Michelle noticed how the medical team seemed surprised by his rapid improvement, but she had a feeling his recovery had something to do with what, or who, he remembered. During one quiet afternoon, while she was helping him with his physical therapy exercises, Mr. Maxwell spoke up in a clearer voice than she'd heard yet. "You look just like her, you know," he said, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the therapy ball. "Your grandmother, Martha. Same kind eyes." Michelle's heart skipped a beat. "You recognize me now?" "Earlier you thought I was her." He smiled weakly. "The mind plays tricks when you're coming out of darkness. But I'd know Martha's granddaughter anywhere. I've kept track of your family over the years, though from a distance. Your graduation from nursing school, your mother's teaching award, I know it all." "But why?" Michelle asked, helping him sit up straighter in bed. "My mother told me about how you helped our community, but I feel like there's more to the story." Mr. Maxwell was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the city skyline through his window. "Your grandmother saved my life," he finally said. "Not just once, but in every way that matters. She taught me what real courage looks like." He told her about 1963, when he was a young businessman trying to make his mark in a divided world. Martha had started as his housekeeper but quickly became much more, an advisor, a friend, and eventually his moral compass. She'd shown him how his privilege could be used to make real change, not just token gestures. "We created a foundation together," he revealed, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Secret at first, but it grew. Educational scholarships, business loans, community development, all in areas banks wouldn't touch back then. Martha managed it all behind the scenes. She was brilliant with numbers and even better with people." Michelle listened, fascinated, as he described how her grandmother had expertly navigated both worlds, the wealthy white business community and the struggling black neighborhoods, to channel resources where they were needed most. "But something's wrong now," he continued, his expression darkening. "Before my stroke, I found some discrepancies in the foundation's accounts. Large sums of money disappearing, then reappearing in different places. I was investigating it when—" He trailed off, looking troubled. "When you had your stroke," Michelle finished quietly. "Mr. Maxwell, I found a power of attorney form with your nephew's signature. It looked strange." His face hardened. "Thomas. He's been trying to get control of everything for years. The foundation especially. He knows it exists but doesn't know its full scope. Martha and I made sure of that." He reached for Michelle's hand. "The real documentation is hidden in my office at home, behind the painting of the old oak tree." Martha chose that hiding spot, said it reminded her of where we first met. Just then, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Michelle quickly resumed the physical therapy exercises as Thomas burst into the room, his expensive suit as immaculate as ever. "Uncle Robert," he exclaimed, though Michelle noted how his smile didn't reach his eyes. "The doctors say you're making remarkable progress. I've been handling everything at the office, so don't worry about a thing." Mr. Maxwell's grip on Michelle's hand tightened slightly. "Thank you, Thomas," he said calmly. "Nurse Anderson here has been telling me all about my treatment, every medicine, every procedure, all carefully documented." Thomas's smile flickered for just a moment. "Yes, well, we want to make sure you get the best care possible. Speaking of care, I've been thinking it might be time to transfer you to a private facility." "I'm comfortable here." Mr. Maxwell cut him off firmly. "In fact, I've never felt safer." As Thomas left the room, clearly frustrated, Michelle caught Mr. Maxwell's meaningful look. They both knew that time was running out. Whatever was hidden in that office, they needed to find it before Thomas did. The real question was, how could Michelle protect both her patient and her grandmother's legacy while staying within the bounds of her professional duties? Michelle couldn't stop thinking about the hidden documents Mr. Maxwell had mentioned. During her evening shift, while helping him with his dinner, she noticed he seemed unusually agitated. "Something's not right," he said quietly, pushing away his barely touched soup. "I overheard Thomas on his phone earlier. He's planning to move me to a private facility by the end of the week, regardless of what I want." Michelle frowned, adjusting his pillows. "But he can't do that without your consent, can he? That power of attorney you found," Mr. Maxwell's voice trembled slightly. "I never signed it. I'm certain now. Thomas must have. Well, you can guess." He looked out the window at the darkening sky. "My memory of the days before my stroke is getting clearer. I remember finding evidence of massive withdrawals from the foundation's accounts. Millions of dollars, all traced back to offshore companies." A soft knock at the door made them both jump. It was Mr. Parker, the attorney, looking more disheveled than Michelle had ever seen him. "I came as soon as I could," he said, closing the door quietly behind him. "The board meeting today." Thomas tried to push through some major changes to the foundation's structure. Mr. Maxwell attempted to sit up straighter, wincing at the effort. "What kind of changes?" "He wants to consolidate all the separate accounts into one main fund, under his direct control." Mr. Parker pulled out some papers from his briefcase. "He's claiming it's for better oversight, but something feels wrong. The timing, right after your stroke." Michelle watched Mr. Maxwell's heart monitor showing elevated readings. "Sir, you need to stay calm," she reminded him gently. "Your recovery is still delicate." "My recovery won't matter if Thomas destroys everything Martha and I built," he replied, his voice growing stronger with determination. "Michelle, I need your help. The documents in my office, they're the only proof of what the foundation really is and what Thomas has been doing." Mr. Parker looked between them, confused. "What documents?" "Records of every transaction, every project, every life we changed," Mr. Maxwell explained. "Martha kept meticulous notes of everything. She knew someday we might need to prove where the money really went. But more importantly, there's evidence of Thomas's embezzlement, documents I gathered before my stroke." Michelle felt torn. As a nurse, her duty was to her patient's health. But as her grandmother's granddaughter— "The painting of the oak tree," she said slowly. That's what you said they're hidden. Mr. Maxwell nodded. Behind it is a small safe. The combination. He closed his eyes, concentrating. Martha's birthday. She always said nobody would think to try that date. Just then, they heard rapid footsteps approaching. Michelle quickly pretended to be checking Mr. Maxwell's vitals as Thomas burst in, followed by two men in expensive suits. "Uncle Robert," Thomas announced, his voice dripping with false concern. "I've made all the arrangements. These gentlemen are from Pine Grove Private Care Facility. They'll be transferring you first thing tomorrow morning." Mr. Maxwell's heart monitor began beeping faster. "I've already told you I'm staying here." "I'm afraid you don't have a choice," Thomas smiled, pulling out a folder. "As your legal guardian, thanks to this power of attorney, I'm acting in your best interests." Michelle felt her phone vibrate in her pocket, a text from Mr. Parker, who had quietly slipped out during Thomas's entrance. "Can you get to the office tonight? I'll handle the legal delay tactics here." Looking at Mr. Maxwell's worried face, Michelle made her decision. Her shift ended in an hour. The family estate was just across town. Her grandmother had risked everything to build something meaningful. Now it was her turn to protect that legacy. "Mr. Maxwell needs his rest," she said firmly, stepping between Thomas and the bed. "Hospital policy states no major decisions about patient care can be made after visiting hours. You'll have to come back tomorrow morning." Thomas glared at her but couldn't argue with hospital protocols. As he left with his entourage, Michelle caught Mr. Maxwell's eye. They both knew they had only one night to save everything her grandmother and he had built. The question was, could she find the documents in time? And more importantly, would they be enough to stop Thomas before he destroyed decades of secret good work? The night air was crisp as Michelle pulled up to the Maxwell estate just after midnight. Mr. Parker had arranged for the security guards to let her in, telling them she was retrieving medical documents. Her hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the front door, feeling the weight of her grandmother's legacy with every step. The massive house was eerily quiet, moonlight streaming through tall windows and casting strange shadows on the wooden floors. Michelle followed Mr. Maxwell's directions to his home office on the second floor, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. "Third door on the right," she whispered to herself, remembering his instructions, past the library. The office was exactly as he described, walls lined with books, a heavy wooden desk, and there, above the fireplace, the painting of the old oak tree. Michelle's breath caught when she saw it. She recognized that tree. It was the one her grandmother used to talk about, where she'd first met Robert Maxwell during a thunderstorm in 1963. Using a chair from the desk, Michelle carefully lifted the painting from its hooks. Behind it, just as Mr. Maxwell had said, was a small wall safe. Her fingers shook as she entered the combination, her grandmother's birthday. "Please work," she whispered. The safe clicked open. Inside was a thick folder, its edges worn with age. As Michelle opened it, something fluttered to the floor, another photograph. This one showed her grandmother and Mr. Maxwell standing in front of a newly opened school, both beaming with pride. The date on the back read 1965, our first project. But before she could look further, a noise downstairs made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy ones moving purposefully through the house. Michelle quickly gathered the documents and slipped behind the office door, heart pounding. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by hushed voices. "Uncle Robert's office is up here," she heard Thomas say. "Whatever he's hiding, it has to be in there. Once we find it, we can move him to Pine Grove tomorrow and handle everything quietly." "And if he refuses to sign the transfer papers?" asked a second voice. "That's why we have a backup power of attorney, remember?" Thomas laughed coldly. "Now help me search. There must be records of where all that foundation money really went." Michelle held her breath as they entered the office. From behind the door, she could see Thomas heading straight for the desk, while his companion moved to the bookshelf. "The safe," Thomas suddenly exclaimed, noticing the painting askew. He rushed to it, yanking it further off the wall. "It's open and empty," his face contorted with rage. "Someone's been here already." Taking advantage of their distraction, Michelle slipped out from behind the door and ran. She could hear shouts behind her as she flew down the hallway, clutching the precious documents to her chest. "Stop her!" Thomas yelled, But Michelle was already racing down the stairs, her nurse's training making her sure-footed even in the dark. She burst out of the house and ran to her car, hands shaking as she fumbled with the keys. As she pulled away from the estate, she could see Thomas and his companion running out the front door, their faces twisted with anger in her rearview mirror. Back at the hospital, she found Mr. Parker waiting anxiously in Mr. Maxwell's room. "Did you get them?" he asked as she rushed in, still breathing heavily. Michelle nodded, pulling out the folder. And something else. Thomas was there. He was looking for these too, talking about some backup power of attorney. Mr. Maxwell attempted to sit up in his bed, alert despite the late hour. "Quick, let me see them." As they spread the documents on his bed tray, the full scope of Thomas's deception became clear. Bank statements showed millions diverted to offshore accounts, forged signatures, falsified reports, but more importantly, they found the true records of the foundation, decades of quiet work building schools, funding scholarships, supporting small businesses. "My grandmother recorded everything," Michelle said softly, looking at the careful notes in handwriting she recognized. "Every dollar, every project, every life changed." Mr. Maxwell smiled, tears in his eyes. "She always said the truth would protect us in the end. Now, thanks to you, it will." He took Michelle's hand. "Your grandmother would be so proud. But we're not done yet. Thomas won't give up easily. We need to move quickly before he tries something else." Looking at the precious documents spread before them, Michelle knew the real fight was just beginning. But with her grandmother's meticulous records and Mr. Maxwell's determination, they'd finally had a chance to protect the legacy that had been hidden for so long. Dawn was breaking over the city when Thomas stormed into Mr. Maxwell's hospital room, his face flushed with anger. He stopped short when he saw not only his uncle and Michelle, but also Mr. Parker and 2 police detectives. "What's going on here?" Thomas demanded, trying to maintain his composed facade. The expensive suit he wore couldn't hide the fact that he hadn't slept all night. "Please, nephew, come in," Mr. Maxwell said calmly from his bed. "We were just discussing some interesting financial discoveries." He gestured to the documents spread across his bed tray. "Would you care to explain why millions of dollars from our family foundation have been flowing into accounts in the Cayman Islands?" Thomas's face went pale, but he quickly recovered. "Uncle Robert, you're clearly not well. This is exactly why I'm moving you to private care today." He pulled out a document from his briefcase. "I have the transfer papers right here." "Actually," Mr. Parker spoke up, "those won't be necessary. We've already filed a police report about the forged power of attorney. The hospital has been notified that only Mr. Maxwell has the authority to make decisions about his care." One of the detectives stepped forward. "Mr. Thomas Maxwell, we'd have some questions about several suspicious transactions, as well as evidence of document forgery." Michelle watched as Thomas's confident mask began to crack. "This is ridiculous. Everything I did was legal. I had authorization." "From this power of attorney?" Michelle held up the document she'd found earlier. "The one with the signature that doesn't match any of Mr. Maxwell's other signatures from that time. The one dated the day before his stroke." "You have no right to interfere," Thomas snapped at her. "You're just a nurse." Mr. Maxwell's voice cut through the tension like steel. "She has every right. Michelle is Martha Wilson's granddaughter, and Martha was much more than just my housekeeper. She was my partner in building this foundation, my most trusted advisor, and the reason I dedicated my life to helping others." Thomas laughed bitterly. "So that's what this is about. Your guilty conscience over some maid from the 60s. "Watch your mouth," Michelle said quietly, her grandmother's strength flowing through her. "While you were trying to steal money meant for scholarships and community programs, my grandmother was helping build something meaningful. We have proof of everything: your embezzlement, the forged documents, even the suspicious timing of Mr. Maxwell's stroke." The second detective stepped forward, holding up a search warrant. "We've already frozen the offshore accounts we could trace. Our forensics team is very interested in analyzing Mr. Maxwell's medical records and medication history from the days leading up to his stroke." All the color drained from Thomas's face. "You can't prove anything about that," he whispered. "Maybe not yet," Mr. Maxwell said. "But we found the records of your visits to the hospital pharmacy. Interesting timing, requesting access to my medication records right before my stroke." The detective moved toward Thomas, handcuffs ready. "Sir, please place your hands behind your back. You're under arrest for financial fraud, forgery, and pending investigation of attempted murder." As Thomas was led away in handcuffs, his expensive suit wrinkled and his perfectly styled hair disheveled, he turned back one last time. "Uncle Robert, everything I did was to protect our family's wealth. You're giving it all away to strangers." Mr. Maxwell shook his head sadly. "No, Thomas. I'm investing it in people who will make this world better, just like Martha taught me to do." He turned to Michelle, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandmother showed me that real wealth isn't about what you keep, it's about what you give back." Michelle squeezed his hand gently. She would be proud to see her work continuing. Mr. Maxwell smiled. "The foundation needs a new director now, someone with both compassion and strength, someone who understands its true purpose." He looked meaningfully at Michelle. "Would you consider taking on that role? Help me continue what your grandmother and I started." Michelle felt tears welling up in her eyes, thinking of her grandmother's courage and determination. The foundation's work had changed countless lives over the decades, all quietly, without fanfare. Now she had the chance to be part of that legacy. "I'd be honored," she said softly, looking out at the rising sun. A new day was dawning, not just for her, but for all the people the foundation would continue to help. 3 months passed quickly after Thomas's arrest. The spring flowers were blooming outside Manhattan General Hospital as Mr. Maxwell prepared for his final discharge. His recovery had been remarkable, surprising even his doctors. "I think it was having a purpose again that helped me heal," he told Michelle as she helped him pack his personal items, knowing there was still work to be done. The news of Thomas's arrest had caused quite a stir in the business world. The investigation had uncovered not only his financial crimes, but also evidence that he had tampered with his uncle's medication, leading to the stroke. He was now facing serious charges and a long prison sentence. But the bigger story, the one that had captured the city's attention, was the revelation of the Maxwell Wilson Foundation's decades of quiet work. After much discussion, Mr. Maxwell had decided it was finally time to bring their mission into the light. "Your grandmother always said secrecy was necessary in the beginning," he explained to Michelle as they walked slowly down the hospital corridor for the last time. "But now, maybe our work can inspire others to do the same." The foundation's office had been transformed. Where Thomas had once plotted his schemes, Michelle now sat at a desk covered with applications for scholarships and business loans. The old photograph of her grandmother and Mr. Maxwell hung proudly on the wall, inspiring her daily work. "We received another thank you letter today," Michelle told Mr. Maxwell as they settled into their weekly meeting. "A young woman who received one of our first public scholarships. She's graduating medical school next month." Mr. Maxwell smiled, his eyes twinkling. "Martha would have loved that. She always said education was the key to changing lives." He pulled out an old leather-bound notebook. "Speaking of which, I found something you should have." Michelle opened the notebook carefully. Inside, in her grandmother's neat handwriting, were detailed notes about every project they'd undertaken, every life they'd touched. But more than that, there were personal observations, hopes, and dreams for the future. "Your grandmother wrote this for you," Mr. Maxwell said softly. "She knew someday her work would need to be carried on. On the last page, there's something special." Michelle turned to the final entry. There, dated just months before her grandmother passed away, was a letter addressed to her. "My dearest granddaughter, if you're reading this, it means you found your way to the work that has meant everything to me. Robert and I built this foundation on a simple belief that everyone deserves a chance to reach their full potential. We had to work in shadows then, but I dream of a time when this work can be done in the light. Take care of this legacy, not just the money and the programs, but the spirit behind them. Remember that real change happens one person at a time, one opportunity at a time. And know that I am so proud of you, my sweet girl. With all my love, Grandma Martha." Tears rolled down Michelle's cheeks as she closed the notebook. She knew, somehow she knew I would be here. Mr. Maxwell patted her hand. Martha had a way of seeing the future clearly. She saw the potential in people, just like she saw it in me all those years ago. He looked out the office window at the city skyline. "And now together, we'll help others see the potential in themselves." Michelle stood up and walked to the window, standing beside the man who had become like a second father to her. Below, the city bustled with life. People rushing to work, students hurrying to class, small business owners opening their shops. Each one with dreams, with potential, waiting for their chance. "You know what the best part is," she said thoughtfully. "Every person we help creates a ripple effect. They go on to help others, just like my grandmother helped you, and you helped so many others." Mr. Maxwell nodded, his eyes bright with purpose. That's how real change happens. Not with grand gestures or flashy donations, but with quiet faith in people's potential. He turned to Michelle with a warm smile. "Ready to get back to work?" Michelle looked at the pile of applications on her desk, each one representing a dream waiting to be realized. "Always," she replied, thinking of her grandmother's legacy living on in every life they touched. There's so much good still to be done. 1 year later, Michelle stood at a podium, looking out at the eager faces before her. The Maxwell Wilson Foundation was celebrating its first public anniversary, and the auditorium was packed with past and present recipients, community leaders, and supporters. "When I first took that nursing assignment," she began, her voice clear and strong, "I had no idea I was walking into my own family's legacy. I just knew I had a patient who needed care." She glanced at Mr. Maxwell, who sat beaming in the front row, healthier than ever. The foundation had flourished in the past year. What was once a secret operation now openly supported hundreds of students, entrepreneurs, and community projects. The old oak tree that had witnessed that first meeting between her grandmother and Mr. Maxwell now graced their official logo, a symbol of growth and strength. "But the real story isn't about me," Michelle continued. "It's about every person in this room. It's about dreams that seemed impossible, doors that appeared locked, until someone believed in you." She gestured to the side of the stage, where photographs lined the wall, decades of quiet victories. A young woman standing in front of her new bakery. A group of students receiving their college acceptance letters. A community center opening its doors. My grandmother Martha used to say that change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in small moments of kindness, in one person reaching out to help another. In the audience, Michelle could see her mother wiping away tears. Next to her sat Mr. Parker, who had become the foundation's trusted legal advisor, ensuring their work would never again be threatened by greed or deception. "Today, we're not just celebrating our first public year," Michelle announced, her voice filled with pride. "We're announcing the Martha Wilson Scholarship Program, which will provide full college funding for 50 students annually. And the Maxwell Community Grant Initiative, supporting small business owners who want to give back to their neighborhoods." The applause was thunderous, but Michelle wasn't finished. She pulled out an old photograph, the one that had started it all, showing her grandmother and Mr. Maxwell at that first civil rights demonstration. "This photograph changed my life," she said softly. "It showed me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's as quiet as a handshake between two people who decide to trust each other and work for change." Mr. Maxwell stood then, making his way to the podium with steady steps. "And sometimes," he added, taking Michelle's hand, "courage looks like a young nurse who risks everything to protect what's right." Together, they unveiled the Foundation's new mission statement, written in elegant letters: "Building bridges of opportunity, one life at a time." The celebration continued long into the evening. Michelle moved through the crowd, listening to stories of lives transformed. A young man who'd opened a technology training center in his old neighborhood. A teacher who'd started a free after-school program. Each success story branched out like the roots of that old oak tree, creating a network of positive change. Later, as the event wound down, Michelle found herself back in her office. The city lights twinkled through the window as she picked up her grandmother's journal, reading that final letter once again. A soft knock at the door made her look up. Mr. Maxwell entered, carrying 2 cups of tea, a habit they developed during his hospital stay. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said, setting the cups down. "Not just of what we've accomplished, but of how you've made it your own." Michelle smiled, touching the journal gently. "Sometimes I feel like she knew exactly how everything would turn out. Like she planted seeds, knowing someday they'd grow into something beautiful." "That's what we're all doing," Mr. Maxwell replied, looking out at the city. "Planting seeds for a future we might not see, but one we believe in with all our hearts." As they stood there, sipping their tea and watching the stars appear over the city, Michelle felt a deep sense of peace. The foundation wasn't just her grandmother's legacy anymore, it was a living, growing thing, touching lives in ways that would ripple out for generations to come. And somewhere, she knew, her grandmother was smiling, watching her granddaughter continue the work she'd begun so many years ago under an old oak tree, with nothing but hope and courage to light the way.